There are moments in life when two lost souls collide, not by chance, but by destiny. This is not just a story about a dog or a child. It is a story about love, loss, healing, and the kind of courage that doesn't bark, but echoes through silence. On Veil Marks, we don't just tell stories. We unearth the quiet heroes among us. If you've ever believed that even the smallest heart can change the world, stay with us. This story holds a lesson that might stay with you forever. Watch until the very end. You won't want to miss what unfolds. In the quiet town of Maple Hollow, winter came not with celebration, but with silence. Snow blanketed every rooftop like a memory long forgotten, and the river, once lively, had turned to glass beneath the icy grip of January. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow, where grief lingered a little longer than it should, and where even the wind carried whispers of old heartaches. Grace Thompson was just 7 years old, but she had already learned that silence could speak louder than words. Her mother had passed away when she was only 3, a loss that had left a quiet void in their small home by the river. Her father, Mike, a former police officer, did his best to be both parent and protector. But since the day he buried his wife, he had spoken less and closed off more. Grace understood that pain could live behind someone's eyes, so she never asked why he didn't smile much anymore. She simply accepted his quiet routines, his long silences, and the unspoken sadness in his gaze. Most afternoons, Grace wandered down to the frozen lake behind their house, carrying her sketchbook and a bundle of colored pencils. The lake was her secret world, a place where reflections turned into stories. She liked to believe that if she looked long enough into the frozen surface, she might catch a glimpse of her mother's face smiling back at her. She'd sit on a log, legs swinging, scribbling images of stars, clouds, and imaginary animals she believed lived just beneath the ice. That particular afternoon was colder than usual. The wind tugged at her scarf, and snow flurries spun through the air like tiny dancers. But Grace, lost in her imagination, didn't notice. Her boots crunched across the surface of the lake as she followed a trail of snowflakes, chasing the idea of a frozen angel. And then, with one careless step, the world cracked. There was no warning. Just a sharp sound like glass shattering, then a scream cut short. The ice beneath her gave way, and she plunged into the black, freezing water. It hit her like knives. Her breath disappeared. Panic surged as she clawed at the edges, but the broken ice only splintered further. The more she struggled, the more hopeless it seemed. The cold swallowed her cries. From the woods nearby, a shadow stirred. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a deer. It was a dog, barely more than a ghost. Ribs showing, fur matted, a limp in one leg. A pit bull by breed, a stray by circumstance. His name was Diesel, though no one in town knew that. He had once worn a collar, once belonged to someone. He had once followed orders, trusted people, slept on warm beds. But those days were long behind him now. What remained was instinct, and something else, something like duty that refused to die. He saw her. A small figure thrashing in the water. Without hesitation, Diesel ran. His paws hit the ice hard. He didn't stop, even when it cracked beneath him. He dove into the lake, paddling with a desperation that came not from survival, but from a sense of purpose. Grace felt something tug at her coat. At first, she thought it was the lake pulling her down, but then she saw the eyes, fierce, amber, and steady. Diesel gripped her jacket in his teeth and swam, fighting the cold with every fiber of his being. He kicked and pulled, guiding her back toward the edge. On the shore, Mike had just stepped outside when he heard the distant barking. Then, a scream, sharp, too familiar, too real. He ran, across the snow, across the yard, heart slamming against his ribs. When he reached the lake, he froze. There, on the broken surface, was his daughter. Half out of the water, a dog bracing himself across her back, shielding her, dragging her forward with teeth clenched on her coat. Mike's breath caught in his throat. He waded in, arms outstretched, and lifted Grace from the water. She coughed, trembled violently, but her eyes fluttered open. She was alive. And Diesel, he didn't run. He didn't growl. He simply sat beside her, soaked to the bone, chest heaving, eyes locked on Mike. It was a look Mike would never forget. Not just gratitude, not just defiance. Something deeper, like two soldiers, nodding at the end of a long battle. Mike carried Grace back to the cabin. He wrapped her in blankets, turned up the heat, held her tight against his chest. Diesel limped behind, refusing to leave the door, refusing to let the girl out of his sight. Later that night, Mike tried to shoo him away. But Grace opened her eyes and whispered, hoarse but sure, "He saved me. Can we keep him?" Mike looked down at the pit bull, who now curled around her like a guardian angel made of muscle and scars. He didn't answer. He just nodded. And somewhere in that silent nod, something shifted. In a world that had forgotten both of them, a little girl and a broken dog, two lost souls had found each other. Who saved who? No one could say, but both had been saved. And neither would ever be alone again. Diesel didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail or chase after tossed sticks like the neighborhood dogs did. He simply lay by Grace's feet, breathing in time with her quiet sighs, his gaze always following her, like a shadow too loyal to drift. He wasn't the kind of dog people wrote happy stories about. At least, not yet. Grace named him Diesel just 3 days after the rescue, sitting on the worn front steps of their old riverside cabin. Her tiny fingers traced the scars on his muzzle as she whispered, "You're like the guy in Daddy's comic book. He didn't need a cape. He just needed heart." And Diesel, for the first time, blinked slowly. That was enough of a thank you. The days that followed were slow, gentle, like raindrops sliding down a window pane in no rush to reach the bottom. Grace, only 7 but old in ways children shouldn't be, began splitting everything she had in two. One half of her peanut butter sandwich went to Diesel. One side of her blanket at night was always lifted, as if she was sure he'd curl beneath it. He did. At first, Mike stayed distant. Grace's father, a former police officer whose soul seemed stitched together with quiet grief, had lived in the echo of his wife's absence for years. He didn't say no when Diesel stayed, but he didn't say much at all. He watched from the hallway as Grace read bedtime stories aloud, sometimes mispronouncing long words, sometimes pausing to ask Diesel what he thought. Diesel never answered, but the way his eyes stayed locked on hers, it was clear. He was listening. One morning, something changed. Grace was reaching for a crayon box on a high shelf in the kitchen when the entire wooden rack it sat on gave way. It tipped violently. Grace froze, but Diesel, silent, scarred Diesel, lunged forward with instinct that went deeper than muscle memory. He shoved her aside with his body, just as the shelf came crashing down. Mike rushed in, expecting the worst. But there she was, Grace, sprawled on the floor, not a scratch on her. And Diesel, his side bruised, standing guard with those same unwavering eyes. For a long moment, Mike said nothing. Then, in a whisper he didn't expect to leave his throat, he said, "Good boy." That night, for the first time, Mike sat by Grace as she read to Diesel. The story was about a knight who was once a monster, misunderstood, feared, until one little girl chose to believe in him. Diesel twitched in his sleep, his legs moving as if running. Mike's brows furrowed. The next day, curiosity led him down a trail he hadn't walked in years, a trail of training manuals, behavior signs, and old instincts. He began watching Diesel closely, noting the way the dog flinched at sharp metallic clicks, the way he perked up when he heard the word clear, the way he stood still at the faintest scent of burning wood. "He's been trained," Mike muttered to himself one night, watching Diesel stare out the frosted window. But for what? Grace, snuggled into her blanket, reached out and rested her palm on Diesel's back. "He's not just a dog," she said sleepily. "He's my safe place. My only one." Mike turned away to hide the way that sentence cracked something in him wide open. Over the next weeks, Diesel began to change. Not all at once. Healing, after all, is never loud. But it was there. His ribs stopped showing as much. His tail, that still tail, began to twitch at the sound of Grace's laughter. He began greeting her at the door after school, lifting his paw to meet her tiny hand as if they shared a secret no one else could understand. Grace drew pictures of Diesel in her sketchbook. Him with wings, him with a crown, him as a firefighter, a hero. "You saved me," she told him one afternoon. "But I think I saved you too." Diesel, lying beside her under the pale orange sky, only nuzzled her hand in reply. Mike found himself lingering in doorways more often, listening to the sound of his daughter's voice, no longer just reading to fill the quiet, but talking, laughing, living again. And all because of a dog with broken bones and an even more broken past. One night, as the first snow of February began to fall, Mike placed a second bowl of food beside Grace's at dinner. Diesel looked up, startled. Mike simply said, "He's earned a place at the table." That evening, Grace pressed her face into Diesel's fur and whispered, "This is home now, because you're in it." Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside that small riverside house, something fragile and beautiful was beginning to thaw. Mike had always been a man of facts, a former police officer who saw the world in black and white. He believed every story had a cause, every wound a reason. So, when Diesel entered their lives like a phantom from some forgotten war, Mike couldn't just look the other way. Diesel was quiet. Too quiet. He never barked at the mailman, never chased after squirrels. He didn't flinch at thunder, but the subtle crackle of burning wood or the sound of certain frequencies on the radio made him freeze, his body taut like a wire, ready to snap. It was Mike who noticed these things, not Grace. She was just a child. She only saw a hero. But Mike saw something else, trauma. He decided to dig deeper. One cold morning, while Grace was at school and Diesel rested curled at the porch, Mike drove him to a local veterinarian. There were no major injuries, just a body that had endured too much. But behind Diesel's right ear, the vet found something unexpected, an almost faded serial code, tattooed in tiny, neat digits, and just beneath his fur, a scar that looked surgical, deliberate, not from a fight. From training. That night, Mike couldn't sleep. He picked up the phone and called Dan, an old friend who had served in the military canine unit overseas. Mike hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. But some people, some losses, build bridges. Even silence can't tear down. Dan answered. They spoke for hours. Mike described Diesel, his behavior, the scar, the code. Dan was silent for a while, then said softly, "He sounds like one of ours." Turns out Diesel wasn't just a stray. He had once been part of a highly specialized K-9 unit trained for international missions. Diesel had saved lives, sniffing out hidden IEDs, tracking lost civilians through chaos and ruins. But during one mission, something had gone terribly wrong. An ambush. Diesel's handler was killed right before his eyes, and Diesel, confused, injured, overwhelmed, had bolted into the forest and never returned. He was marked missing in action, then quietly reclassified as mentally compromised, discarded. Mike sat in the dark after the call, staring at the fireplace. He remembered the way Diesel would whimper softly in his sleep, paws twitching as if running through a nightmare. He remembered the way Grace would gently stroke his ears when those dreams came. She never asked questions. She just held him. Mike had once believed dogs were animals. Loyal, yes, but not capable of grief the way humans were. But Diesel was different. He didn't just mourn. He carried guilt, like a man might, as if he blamed himself for not saving his partner. The next day, something shifted in Mike. He bought a new bed, not for himself, but for Diesel. Set it up in the living room by the fireplace. No more sleeping on cold porches. He picked up fresh beef bones from the butcher, began to add a few minutes to his evening routine, just sitting near Diesel after Grace had gone to bed. He didn't say much. But when he did, he spoke like a man speaking to another soul, not just a dog. "You did your best," Mike whispered one night, barely audible over the crackling fire. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Grace, intuitive as ever, never asked about the new bed or the special meals. But she noticed Diesel was sleeping more peacefully. His eyes didn't dart as much. His tail began to flick just slightly whenever she ran to him after school. One afternoon, Grace drew a new picture, a little girl holding hands with a man and a dog. She handed it to Mike, smiling shyly. "That's you, me, and Diesel," she said. "I made us a real family." Mike stared at the drawing for a long time. In that simple crayon sketch, he saw what his words couldn't say, what Diesel had become, a missing piece that made them whole again. The weight of his own grief started to loosen. He had buried himself in silence since his wife passed, unwilling to feel, unwilling to risk being broken again. But somehow, through a child and a dog both shattered in their own ways, Mike was learning how to heal. Grace would never know the full story behind Diesel's scars. Not yet. To her, he was simply her best friend, her brave protector, her quiet comforter on stormy nights. And perhaps that was all that mattered. Children didn't need war stories or medals. They needed presence. They needed someone or something that would never walk away. As the sun dipped behind the trees and shadows crept across the snow, Diesel lay curled by the fire, head resting gently on Grace's slipper. Mike watched them from the kitchen doorway, the edges of his lips curving upward. Not quite a smile, but close. There was a strange kind of peace in the house now. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. And it began, not with words, but with quiet, with understanding, with the unspoken language of souls that had seen too much and somehow still chose love. Diesel wasn't just a dog, he was a veteran, a survivor. A silent warrior who had lost everything and found his way back, not through war, but through the laughter of a child and the open heart of a man learning to live again. Clearwater had always been a place where everyone knew your name, where the wind carried more gossip than clouds, and the porch lights flickered not out of electricity problems, but as signals of silent conversations. It was a place where things rarely changed, and when they did, The whispers came before the facts. At first, when Diesel arrived, folks were curious. A little girl with a dog at her heels. How quaint, how classic. But as someone leaned in close enough to get a good look, the reaction changed. "That's a pit bull," murmured Mrs. Langford, the post office clerk whose husband once delivered mail with pepper spray tucked in his belt. Why would Mike let a child play with one of those? Rumors have teeth. And in a town like Clearwater, they bite quickly. It didn't take long for murmurs to become meetings. The catalyst came one breezy afternoon. Grace had been walking home from school, Diesel trotting faithfully by her side. Across the street, little Caleb Bennett lost control of his scooter and toppled over. Diesel stepped toward the child, ears perked, body calm. But the boy's mother, frantic and protective, screamed. She pulled Caleb close and glared at Diesel like he was a ticking bomb. "No dog like that should be near children," she told everyone who would listen. It startled him. What if it attacked? The fact that Diesel hadn't even growled didn't matter. The breed had spoken louder than the behavior. The following Saturday, a town safety meeting was held in the old firehouse. The wooden chairs creaked under the weight of concern and fear. Grace sat between Mike and Diesel, clinging tightly to both, her cheeks flushed with confusion more than fear. A woman stood up and voiced what many had been whispering. "We're not saying Mike's a bad father," she began, "but this is a dangerous animal. We have rules in this town." Mike's jaw clenched, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped forward and spoke in the same tone he used as an officer. Steady, reasonable, human. "He's not dangerous. He saved my daughter's life. He's been nothing but gentle. He doesn't bark. He doesn't lunge. He doesn't even beg. If you saw what we've seen, you wouldn't be afraid." The room was quiet, but not convinced. Then, an old voice broke the stillness. "I saw eyes like his once, in men who came back broken, but brave." Everyone turned to look at Mr. George. 92 years old, former soldier, weathered like leather, yet somehow still the sharpest soul in the room. He stood slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "I've looked into the eyes of warriors, and the eyes of men running from pain. That dog doesn't want to hurt anyone. That dog is tired and trying to heal." Silence. Mike glanced at George and gave a silent nod, but still, doubt lingered. The town mayor, trying to find balance, cleared her throat and offered a compromise. "Diesel can stay," she announced, "but only if he's kept on a leash at all times and confined within Mike's property." That night, Grace didn't cry, but she didn't eat much either. She sat on the floor beside Diesel's bed, her tiny fingers tracing circles along his back. "I don't get it," she whispered. "They don't know you. They don't see the same Diesel I do." Mike sat in his armchair nearby, quiet, listening. His heart clenched, not just because of the town's judgment, but because he remembered what it was like to be misunderstood, to grieve in silence while others speculated. The next morning, Grace painted a wooden sign and hung it on their front fence. "Here lives a hero. Please don't fear what you haven't tried to love." Each evening after that, Grace read her favorite stories aloud to Diesel on the porch. Neighbors would pass by. Some avoided eye contact. Others, like old Mr. Dobbins, paused and gave a soft smile. "I remember when folks didn't like my accent," he told Grace one day. "Didn't stop me from speaking." Diesel stayed within the yard, never crossing the line. He sat tall and silent, watching, waiting, earning trust inch by inch. But still, people talked. "Would you trust a loaded gun on 4 legs?" one man asked at the diner. "You'd think folks would have more sense," another muttered near the hardware store. And yet, something was shifting. One afternoon, When Caleb once again fell off his scooter, Diesel didn't move. He stayed where he was, behind the fence. This time Caleb got up, brushed his knees, and glanced over. "Sorry I got you in trouble," he whispered, barely loud enough for Grace to hear. She smiled, and Diesel, perhaps sensing the moment, thumped his tail once. Mike started to notice more than just fear in the faces of passers-by. He saw hesitation, then small gestures of reconsideration, a nod, a slower pace, a returned wave. Even Mrs. Langford, who had once declared Diesel a lawsuit waiting to happen, left a bone-shaped treat in their mailbox with a scribbled note, "For the dog who listens better than most people." In Clearwater, the truth didn't come with loud declarations. It arrived in softened shoulders, in softened hearts. Diesel had not barked once, but somehow he had spoken more deeply than anyone else ever could. He hadn't just found a home with Grace and Mike. He had started, slowly but surely, to win over a town that didn't even know it needed saving, too. The sky had been gray since morning, but no one in the quiet riverside town expected the storm to strike as violently as it did. By early afternoon, the wind began to howl like an ancient voice rising from the valley, warning of something far more powerful than rain. Trees bent under pressure, and the river, usually calm and meandering, swelled with a rage it hadn't shown in decades. Grace, now more confident and full of life thanks to Diesel's presence, had gone to visit her friend Lily across the river that morning. It was supposed to be a short visit, just a few hours of playing dolls and reading stories. No one thought the weather would shift so fast. Mike, busy with repairs at a neighbor's barn, hadn't realized how bad the storm would become until he heard the emergency sirens echo through the town. By the time he jumped into his truck to drive toward Lily's house, the roads were already beginning to flood. The bridge connecting the two sides of the town had collapsed under the weight of debris and rushing water. With his phone signal dead and no radio communication, Mike was stranded, trapped on one side, while his daughter was out there, somewhere in the chaos. Back at the house, Diesel paced near the window. He hadn't moved much that day, but now something inside him stirred, something primal. His ears perked at the sound of the river's roar. He sniffed the air, his whole body tensing. Then, suddenly, as if pulled by an invisible thread, Diesel leaped onto the window ledge, broke through the screen, and took off into the storm. Mike, returning from the bridge, saw the window shattered and Diesel gone. His heart sank. Was it fear? A call from instinct? Diesel never acted without reason. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Diesel ran through the mud and pounding rain with a focus born of his past. His paws slapped against the wet earth, his body moving like a ghost in the storm. He could smell it. Grace's scent mixed with the cold sting of rain and the damp wood of Lily's porch. He didn't hesitate, not even when a tree branch nearly clipped him or when he slipped near a flooded ditch. Every breath he took carried one message: find her. Across town, Grace and Lily had taken shelter in the living room, watching through the window as the world outside turned wild. Lily's mother tried to keep calm, but when the water began to rise at the doorstep and the front door swelled shut from the moisture, panic took root. They moved upstairs, praying help would come. The back window had jammed. The streets were empty. Then they heard it, a low, guttural sound, like something pushing against the back door. A shape emerged from the downpour. Diesel. His coat was soaked and torn in places, his legs trembling, but his eyes burned with purpose. Grace screamed with joy and relief, calling his name. "Diesel!" He barked sharply, pushing again at the door, then leaped up toward the kitchen window. With a force born of desperation, Diesel lunged and shattered the glass with his body. Rain poured in, Shards of glass cut his side, but he didn't flinch. He whined and barked again, calling them to follow. Grace grabbed Lily's hand, but Lily's mom hesitated. "Is it safe?" she whispered. Grace, without fear, nodded. "If Diesel's here, it's the safest place we can be." They climbed out carefully, Diesel leading the way. The backyard was already turning into a shallow lake. Diesel darted toward the alley, an old path between homes that avoided the main road and led toward higher ground. He kept looking back, making sure Grace followed. At one point, a piece of a tree broke loose and came crashing down. Diesel sprang in front of Grace, shielding her with his body. The branch scraped his back, leaving a long gash, but Grace remained untouched. Mud made the path nearly impossible to cross. Grace slipped several times, her hands bleeding from the rough gravel. Diesel stopped, nudged her gently, then stood still so she could hold on to his neck. He guided her step by step. Meanwhile, Mike had abandoned his truck and crossed the stream on foot, using a rope tied between two fence posts as support. He stumbled through the wreckage of fences and flooded yards, calling out, "Grace, Diesel!" Then he saw them at the end of the alley. Grace soaked to the bone, clutching Diesel's back as the dog limped forward, bloody but determined. Behind them, Lily and her mother. Mike ran to them, gathering Grace in his arms. "You found her," Mike whispered to Diesel, voice shaking. "You brought her home." Diesel collapsed. His legs finally gave out. The effort, the pain, the fear. It all caught up with him at once. But his breathing was steady. His eyes flicked toward Grace. She stroked his head gently, tears mixing with rain. "You saved me." Again. The town gathered that night in the local church, which had been converted into an emergency shelter. Word spread quickly of what had happened. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Diesel now whispered in awe. Some wept. Others offered bandages, blankets, thanks. Mr. George, the old veteran who had once defended Diesel, stood up and said, "Some heroes don't wear uniforms. And some don't walk on two legs." In the following days, Diesel's story became the heart of the town's recovery. Photos of Grace curled up beside him in the shelter spread across social media. A rescue fund was started in his name to help train and rehabilitate misunderstood breeds like him. For Mike, something in him had shifted too. Watching Diesel defy storm and instinct to protect Grace broke through the final wall of grief he'd hidden behind for years. He no longer saw Diesel as a broken dog. He saw him as family. As for Grace, she no longer drew alone. Her sketches now showed a girl, a dog, and a sun cutting through storm clouds. Always together, always brave, and Diesel. For the first time in years, he wagged his tail, slowly, steadily, every time he heard Grace's voice. Because now, he wasn't just a protector. He was home. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the bones of the town like a song no one could quite stop humming. Fallen branches still littered the streets. Windows bore marks of wind-lashed debris, and puddles shimmered beneath a pale morning sun. Yet in one modest house at the edge of the valley, something more powerful had begun to shift. Not in the air, but in the hearts of three quiet souls. Mike stood by the kitchen window, watching Grace and Diesel nap on the couch. The little girl's arm draped loosely over the pit bull's neck, her face nestled against his thick fur. Diesel's chest rose and fell, slow and peaceful, and for the first time, Mike noticed the subtle rhythm of trust pulsing between them, like music only a father could hear. He stirred the coffee slowly. The warmth of the mug seeped into his skin, but his thoughts were elsewhere. It had been 4 years since Sarah, his wife, passed away. 4 years of building a wall so high and so thick around his grief that even Grace had to knock to be let in. He'd convinced himself that by staying strong, by staying quiet, he was protecting her. But he wasn't. He was just hiding. That night, when Diesel came back with Grace soaked but alive, something cracked open inside him. It wasn't just relief. It was shame, a father's guilt for not being the one to save her, for letting his own pain silence the joy and fear and love that had once made their house a home. He thought back to the way Diesel had stood guard over Grace, teeth bared at the rushing water, eyes blazing with purpose. No hesitation. No fear, just love. Pure, wordless, fearless love. Mike had never seen anything like it. Not from a dog, not even from himself. And now, the silence between them wasn't cold anymore. It was full. That weekend, Mike brought home an old tent from the attic. "I figured," he said, awkwardly scratching his neck, "we could go camping. Just out back, by the fire pit." Grace blinked, stunned, then grinned so wide her dimples showed. "Can Diesel come too?" Mike chuckled. "I think he'd be mad if we didn't." That night, under a sky riddled with stars, the three of them lay bundled in sleeping bags. Grace pointed out constellations, making up stories about them. Diesel lay beside her, eyes closed but ears twitching, as if guarding every word. "I think," Grace whispered, "Mom would have liked him." Mike swallowed hard. For a long time he said nothing. Then softly, "Your mom loved animals. She would have thought he was a hero." There it was. Her name, spoken aloud after 4 years of silence. Grace turned toward him, eyes shining. "Tell me about her," she said. So he did. Mike spoke of Sarah's laugh, the way it filled a room like sunlight. Her stubbornness, her kindness, her terrible singing voice. He talked until his voice cracked, until the stars blurred behind tears, until he wasn't holding anything back anymore. And Grace listened, quietly, one hand resting on Diesel's paw. From that day forward, things changed. Little by little, Mike started waking up earlier, making breakfast with 2 plates, one for Grace, one for Diesel. He repaired the broken swing in the yard. He picked Grace up from school instead of letting the bus do it. And Diesel, that once ghost of a warrior, began to glow. His gait grew steadier, his eyes less wary. He barked once when a squirrel darted across the lawn, and the sound startled them all. Not because it was loud, but because it was life. It was the voice of a dog who had found a reason to speak again. Mike built a small wooden doghouse in the yard, though Diesel preferred the living room couch. Grace insisted on decorating it with hand-painted flowers and stars. "It's not a doghouse," she explained. "It's a memory fort, for all the days we didn't get to have before." Sundays became photo days. Grace would dress Diesel in silly scarves or tiny sunglasses, and Mike, who once hated cameras, started taking pictures again. Black and white shots of muddy paws, peanut butter sticky kisses, laughter caught in motion. One afternoon, Mike found himself at his old writing desk, the one he hadn't touched since Sarah died. A sheet of paper sat before him, blank. Then, slowly, he wrote, "Dear Diesel, you came to us like a ghost, quiet, broken, waiting for the world to end. But you saved my daughter. You saved me. You taught us how to breathe again, how to remember what home feels like. This collar around your neck is more than leather and steel. It's a promise that no matter what anyone says, you are family. Love, Mike." He folded the letter, placed it in a tiny glass vial, and attached it to Diesel's collar. Diesel blinked slowly, then licked his hand. It was enough. Grace found it that evening. She read it twice, then hugged her dad so tight he had to pretend something was in his eye. Diesel wagged his tail and leaned against them, a pillar of strength made of scars and second chances. The town hadn't forgotten the storm, but it began to remember Diesel differently now, not as a threat, but as a guardian. People started waving at Mike. Some even brought treats for the dog who saved a little girl. And so, life moved on. Not back to the way it was, but forward, toward something new, something whole. In the quiet, in the space where grief had once echoed, laughter grew. In the spaces between words, love bloomed. And in the silence between a father, a daughter, and a dog, they found the loudest kind of healing. We saved each other, Mike thought one night as he watched them sleeping. His daughter curled into a hero without a cape. In silence, we found the loudest love. 1 year had passed since the great storm, and in the small river town where silence once echoed louder than joy, the air now carried a different kind of stillness, softer, warmer, filled with stories unspoken but deeply felt. Diesel, the once wandering pit bull who had saved a little girl and found himself a home, was now clearly aging. His strides were slower, his naps longer. He no longer raced toward the door when someone approached. Instead, he lifted his head with calm wisdom, as if to say, "I see you. I've seen enough." Grace had grown too. Now 8, she was still the bright-eyed girl who painted clouds like whispers and wrote poems under trees. But she carried herself differently, more grounded, more thoughtful. Her best friend wasn't just her dog. Diesel had become something more sacred, a quiet guardian, a confidant, and the thread that wove her little family together. His presence was a daily miracle, and she understood, perhaps too early for her age, that miracles are not meant to last forever. One morning in spring, Grace placed a small printed book on the kitchen table. Its cover showed a sketch of a young girl in a red coat and a scruffy dog with kind eyes. The title read, "The Dog Who Waited by the Door." It was her first book, a story she wrote and illustrated herself. When Mike picked it up, his hands trembled slightly. He didn't say much. He simply looked at Diesel, then at Grace, and nodded. "Let's make sure everyone gets to read this." They did more than that. A month later, the family opened a small coffee shop in town. It wasn't grand or trendy. It had creaky floors and mismatched chairs, but it had shelves of books, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla, and soft music that sounded like home. They called it the Silent Hero. And every detail, from the paw-shaped cookies to the reading corner with a small beanbag, was a tribute to the dog who had once been unwanted, unseen, forgotten. Diesel lay most days near the fireplace, head on paws, his ears perking up when someone said Grace's name or when a child sat beside him with a book. People came, some out of curiosity, others out of memory. An elderly woman touched Diesel's head and whispered, "My husband had a dog like you during the war." A boy who'd once feared pit bulls brought his friends to meet the hero dog. The shop became more than a cafe. It was a haven, a living storybook, a reminder that courage often comes in silence and love often walks on 4 legs. The town, once wary, had changed too. Where once suspicion lingered in glances and murmurs, now came warmth and respect. Grace's book sold dozens of copies in the first week. The local library asked her to do a reading. Diesel sat beside her as she read the final line, his tail thumping gently. "He didn't need to speak," Grace read, her voice steady but soft. "His love was louder than words." But time, as it always does, moved forward. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the river in gold, Grace found Diesel sitting by the front door, just as he always had. She sat beside him, leaning against his shoulder. Mike watched from the porch swing, a cup of coffee in hand, the same cup Grace had painted for him last Father's Day, with Diesel's paw print at the bottom. "Do you think he knows?" Grace asked quietly. "Knows what?" Mike replied, though he already understood. "That he's not going to be here forever." Mike didn't answer right away. He looked at Diesel, then at Grace. "I think he knows that he doesn't have to be, because what he gave us is already forever." In the fall, a statue was unveiled in the town park. It wasn't tall or made of shiny bronze. It was carved from wood, weathered by hand, showing Diesel in his quiet stance, head slightly tilted, ears alert, eyes soft. At his feet lay a book, and behind him, carved into a wooden plaque, were the words Grace had written. He didn't bark much, but his love echoed forever. Diesel's last winter was gentle. He slept more, ate less, but every evening he still took his place by the door. He didn't guard anymore. He watched. He watched life bloom. Grace growing taller, Mike laughing again, neighbors stopping by to leave treats or stories. He watched the town become what he always hoped the world could be: safe, warm, forgiving. One morning, Grace woke up and Diesel wasn't by her bed. She found him by the front door, still, peaceful, like he had simply drifted into a deeper kind of sleep. There was no panic, no screaming, just tears, quiet, honest, grateful. Mike wrapped him in Grace's old red blanket and carried him to the backyard, where the cherry tree bloomed early that year. They buried him with the book, the first copy, and the letter Mike had written the night after the storm. Weeks passed, then months. But Diesel never truly left. Grace still talked to him when she was alone. Mike still kept his leash by the door, not as a memory, but as a thank you. And the town, now marked by one dog's quiet courage, found itself transformed by something simple and ancient. The reminder that love is never wasted, and the smallest presence can leave the loudest echo. So each night, after the shop closed and the lights dimmed, a candle remained lit by the door. Not because anyone expected Diesel to return, but because the warmth he left behind was worth honoring. Grace once wrote in her diary, "Some heroes wear capes. Mine wore silence. And if you ever visit that little cafe by the river, you might see a little girl, now grown, smiling behind the counter. You might hear a soft bark in the wind, or feel a kind of peace you can't explain. That's him, still watching, still waiting. Forever home. Sometimes the most powerful love speaks no words. As you reach the final frame of this journey, ask yourself, who truly saves whom? Grace, Diesel, and Mike may be just characters in a tale. Or perhaps they are mirrors of something you've felt deep inside. If this story moved you, leave a comment, subscribe to Vale Marks, and help us reach 1,000 souls who believe in stories that heal. As the great Fred Rogers once said, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Today, maybe that helper has 4 paws and a silent heart. Thank you for watching. Your support means the world and inspires us to create more stories that matter.